There are gifts the world rarely asks for. To be hospitable to a stranger when you have almost nothing to give. To open your door at evening to two travelers you have never seen, knowing one more night of bread and oil will leave you with nothing to break in the morning. In the rough hill country of ancient Phrygia, in a small thatched cottage at the very top of a long climb, an old husband and wife once gave such a gift, without knowing what they were giving, or to whom. The story has come down to us from the Roman poet Ovid, 2,000 years ago, who said he had it from older mouths than his own. It is the story of an old man called Philemon, and his wife called Baucis, and the evening two ragged travelers came down out of the rain, and of the love between them that outlasted, in a manner of speaking, even the lovers themselves. The two travelers were not what they seemed. They were Zeus, the father of all the gods of Olympus, and Hermes, the swift messenger, who often walked the earth together to see how mortals treated strangers. On this day, they had taken the shape of two tired old men, with gray beards and dusty cloaks and feet sore from a long road. They came first into a rich valley, a place of wheat fields and orchards and slate-roofed houses with smoke rising from every chimney. They were hungry. They were tired. They knocked at the gate of a great house and were turned away. They knocked at the gate of a second great house and a third and a fourth. At each gate a dog was set on them, or a servant came out to laugh at their patched cloaks. The wealthier the house, the louder the laughter. By dusk, every door in the valley had been shut against them. The two travelers turned without complaint and began the long climb up the hill that rose above the valley, toward the single small light still burning at the very summit. At the very top of the hill, where the wind never stopped and the heather grew thin in poor stony soil, stood a small thatched cottage. Inside were Baucis and Philemon, the old husband and old wife who had lived there together since the year they were married, more than 50 years before. They had no children. They had one goose, a fierce protective creature they had kept for years and never had the heart to eat. They had a small garden. They had each other. When they heard the slow knock at their door in the gathering dark, Baucis went to open it without hesitation, as she had always opened her door to anyone who came. The two old travelers stood there on the step, soaked through and shivering. Baucis took one look at them and stepped back to let them in. Philemon was already moving toward the hearth, to throw a fresh handful of dry sticks on the embers. "Come in," he said. "Come and sit by the fire. You will sleep here this evening." They did not have much to give. Baucis brought out the last of the bread and the last of the olives from a clay jar in the corner, and a little salted cheese she had been saving for the festival. She filled an old wooden bowl with water from the well and set it on the hearth to warm so the two travelers could wash their feet. Philemon brought up from a low cupboard the last of their wine, a single small jug of dark country wine they had been keeping for an occasion they could no longer quite remember. They set the meal on a wobbling three-legged table that Philemon steadied with a folded piece of broken pottery, the way he had steadied it for many years. The two travelers ate slowly and gratefully and praised the bread. And as the meal went on, Baucis noticed something that made her go very still. The little jug of wine, no matter how many times Philemon poured from it, was always full to the brim again. Baucis touched her husband's sleeve and showed him silently. Philemon looked and looked again, and his weathered face went pale. They knew at once what such a small, impossible thing must mean. They were old people, raised on the old stories. They knew that God sometimes walked the earth, and they knew what such a wine jug meant, and they were terribly, suddenly ashamed of how little they had set on their own table. There was only one thing left to offer. They had one goose. Philemon got up to catch her. The goose, who was wiser than either of them and who had been watching the two strangers all evening with her bright black eye, understood at once what was being prepared. She fled. She fled, hissing, across the small dirt floor, past the hearth, and straight into the laps of the two travelers, where she settled herself with great dignity, and looked back at Philemon as if to say, "Not tonight." The taller of the two travelers laughed quietly and laid a gentle hand on her feathered back. Then he looked up at the old couple, and both of them saw in his face exactly who he was already. The travelers rose and the cottage rose around them, and the two old people found themselves standing on the doorstep with the night air sharp on their faces. The gods, taller now and clothed in something other than rags, told them to come outside and to climb a little further up the hill, and not to look back until they were given leave. Baucis and Philemon climbed slowly, helping each other over the rough stones, the way they had climbed many lesser hills together in 50 years of marriage. When the gods told them they could turn, they turned. Below them, where the rich valley had been, was a wide, dark sheet of water. Every house and gate and barking dog had been quietly washed away. There was no shouting from the valley. There was no one left to shout. Only their own small thatched cottage, far below at the top of its hill, was still standing. And as they watched, even the cottage was changing. The thatch was becoming carved stone. The walls were becoming pale marble. Their own small home was rising into a quiet temple at the very summit. The gods asked them what they wished for, in return for what they had given that evening. Baucis and Philemon looked at one another for a long moment, in the way that old married people sometimes do, where almost a whole conversation passes between two people without a single word being said aloud. Then Philemon, who had always been the slower spoken of the two, answered for them both. They wished to be the keepers of the temple, he said. They would tend it together for whatever years remained to them. So they did. They lived in a small back room of the marble temple where the gods had spared them a hearth and a sleeping pallet and an old olive tree growing in the courtyard. They swept the temple floor every morning. They lit a small fire on the altar every evening. They greeted every traveler who came up the long road, and they fed them no matter how poor the bread happened to be that week. And in this way, the years passed quietly over the temple at the summit of the mountain. They grew old and then older. Their backs bent. Their hair, which had been gray when the gods came, went white. Philemon's hands shook in the morning. Baucis began to forget small things, and then to forget them more often, although she never once forgot her husband's face. One quiet summer evening, as they were standing together at the gate of the temple, watching the long, slow gold of the sunset fall over the valley of still water below, they spoke of the only thing they had never wished aloud. They were so old now. One of them would have to go first. Whichever of them was left behind would have to spend the last of his or her days alone in the marble temple, by the small hearth in the back room, with the empty pallet beside them. Neither of them, they said quietly to one another, could quite bear the loneliness. So they prayed. They prayed together that whatever hour the gods chose for them, they would go in the same hour, that neither would have to bury the other, that neither would have to spend a single morning waking up to a silent chamber. And the gods heard them. As they stood there at the gate of the temple, hand in hand, watching the gold fade out of the sky, Baucis looked at Philemon and saw that small green leaves were beginning to grow out of the soft white hair on his temples. He looked at her and saw the very same. Bark was rising slowly up their old bodies, gentle as a kind sleeping. They had only time, the two of them, to whisper one last farewell to each other before the bark closed over their faces. And in that moment, at the gate of the marble temple at the top of the hill, two trees stood where there had been two old people. A tall oak and a linden, growing so close that their roots wound together under the warm summer earth, and their branches lifted together into the evening sky. And travelers who passed that way for hundreds of years after would stop and look up at the two intertwined trees by the temple gate and remember what kindness given freely to a stranger at evening had been quietly given back. This was Forgotten Fables. Follow the channel when you want the next story the loud world forgot.